Welcome to the final installment of our four-part lecture series. We're going to be talking about the neuroscience of aphasia recovery. So thinking a little bit more about what happens over the time course of having the stroke, developing aphasia, and then what happens over time. And we're going to think about just spontaneously, the brain naturally changing over time, and also therapy aided. What we do know, the details are complicated and we don't all agree on the details just yet, but what we know unequivocally is that strokes change the functional organization of the brain. This is probably not surprising because we know that the brain is able to change, right? That's all about what neuroplasticity is. And so a stroke to some part of the brain disrupts that brain area, but also all the connections it had to other parts of the brain. Brain areas are typically connected within a hemisphere, across hemispheres. And so those networks can be disrupted by a stroke. So here's a great example of a schematic that demonstrates that. They had a pretty large sample of individuals with strokes and aphasia, about 100 you can see there. And what they did is they had them lie in the scanner and just rest. This is called resting state. During this, we collect functional brain images, which broadly measure blood flow and oxygen movement in the brain. What this allows us to do at rest is to calculate what brain regions typically talk to one another often, because at rest, they still have time courses that are heavily correlated with other networks or other brain regions that they typically talk to. So we can kind of see the, let's say, layout of the brain and the typical relationships that are there. It's also really easy to do this in individuals with stroke because they don't have to participate in a task in the scanner. That can be a little bit easier for individuals who do have more severe aphasia. But this has drawbacks because we're not looking at a specific language task. We're just looking at how the brain seems to be connected at rest. So it's a different interpretation than looking at task-specific activation. But the big overall takeaway here you can see in bold, lesions to the left hemisphere. An example, let me get my pointer. An example is this individual A and this individual B. Areas in black are stroke. Areas around the black in red and yellow are individual areas that were connected to the site of the stroke. So what they did with this computation is they put a seed into the lesion, meaning that they told their computational algorithm to look and see what brain areas were functionally connected to the areas that are now stroke damaged. And you can see over here, we've got lots of dorsal stream connections. Not surprisingly, we've talked about the dorsal stream being a network of areas that work together. And in the right hemisphere, we've got a pretty complementary set of regions that seem to be connected to its left hemisphere homologue, meaning the same regions on the left side. Over here in this very different lesion, we've got also connectivity that looks like some dorsal and a little bit of ventral stream. And we've got those complementary right hemisphere activation connectivity, meaning homologue regions in the right hemisphere are also connected to that lesion site. So therefore, we know the brain can change, right? We've known this for a very long time. What we now want to figure out is what reorganization of the brain is actually helpful and what reorganization of the brain is harmful. That's currently, I would say, the bread and butter of what many of us in cognitive neuroscience of aphasia and language are trying to figure out. And it's just a very complicated story because everyone has a different pattern of stroke damage. Everyone has different intrinsic variables about themselves, so language capacity before the stroke, brain capacity before the stroke, age of stroke, other things related to neuroplasticity, like overall brain health, therapy availability, right? This makes it very hard for us to understand the overall potential and patterns of brain change after stroke. Some colleagues and I, this first paper here with the arrow pointing to the right, we're looking at how the lesion damage in the left hemisphere reorganizes the other hemisphere. And several other individuals have looked at how the right hemisphere contributes to aphasia recovery. A recent paper by Stephen Wilson's group showed modest evidence for for the extent to which the right hemisphere contributes to language recovery in aphasia. In other words, the jury is still out, and it might differ based on a few factors. One of the factors that some think is most important is the right hemisphere becomes more involved early on after the stroke and perhaps less over time. And that's what this graph is showing here. So this is a nice schematic, again, of the same two people we saw 2 slides ago. So this is A with their dorsal stream lesion, and B over here with their more kind of Wernicke's area, but more dorsal and ventral stream lesion. And what you're seeing over time is a change from the acute, which is typically defined as weeks after the stroke, to subacute, extending weeks to months, to chronic, which many of us say is at least 6 months after the stroke. And you're seeing differences again in that functional resting state change. And what you can see is that in the acute stage, because typically the brain is very inflamed, there's a lot of processes going on, we don't see a lot of activation, period. You can probably notice that in both of these individuals, and not a lot in the right hemisphere. But the big change happens in those weeks to early months after the stroke. You can see a big change in how much activation you're seeing in the left hemisphere and typically in the right. In the chronic stage, typically we're seeing more activation left and right. And some people are arguing there's an extent to which this right hemisphere activation, if it's still active in the chronic stage, it actually might not be super helpful for aphasia recovery. It might be inhibitory, but the jury is still out there. But the main conclusion is that there is a change probably in how the brain's activation is able to support language as one moves from acute to subacute to chronic. One thing we like to think about is what might happen at a network level to the brain. So in the prior lecture, I talked about how the brain has a variety of regions that work together to form networks. What some individuals are thinking about is mapping those networks, properties of those networks, to figure out who recovers versus who does not recover as well from aphasia. Now, one idea that's become popular is this idea of modularity. The brain is segregated into distinct systems. That's the current thought process. So for example, like the visual system, the hearing system, systems like that, they're kind of modules that work together to achieve vision and hearing. There's probably a module that has to support language in some way. And so what individuals have started to do is look at these first few months after stroke and figure out, is there a change in how modular the brain becomes, with the idea being more modular is better. More modular should support better recovery. That seems to be what is the current idea. So this group demonstrated in a relatively large proportion of stroke individuals. Not everyone had aphasia, by the way. This is stroke in general. You can see that they're looking at a variety of brain networks down here. So it's not just looking at things related to language. But over time, individuals who tended to make a better overall recovery after stroke tended to be the ones whose brain networks became more modular over time. They looked more like this over here, which is our control, an age-matched sample without stroke. So modularity might play a big role, and the ability of the brain to become more modular may support things like aphasia recovery. So that's something that we're currently working on in general as cognitive neuroscientists, but also in our lab. The other question is, yes, the brain changes naturally over time, but how can we affect change with behavioral therapy, with speech therapy? The overall idea is that speech therapy probably does give an extra oomph to the change especially in those kind of subacute earlier on stages. But there's a lot of research supporting that speech therapy in particular can still change brain function in the chronic stages, right? Many, many months and years after the stroke. So the overall issue with a lot of these studies, mine being sharing this issue, is that it's really difficult to find a huge sample size of individuals with aphasia who want to come in and participate fully in MRI studies or EEG, then do therapy, then come back to be scanned. So there are a few really great studies going on right now that have much larger sample sizes to look out for. But generally what we find is just an overall principle of yes, speech therapy does tend to affect change in both language and the brain, but it's not, there's no pattern that's really differentiable across people. And that shouldn't be surprising as you've gotten this far in this series, because we know all the strokes are different, people's personal factors are different, the premorbid stroke language abilities are different. So there's a lot of reasons why drawing patterns and conclusions are hard. A recent meta-analysis synthesis of looking at brain change longitudinally after stroke, again by Stephen Wilson's group, really emphasizes that we know the brain can change. We know that activation change is possible. It's just figuring out the best methods to study that, and we're still working on that. The ultimate goal, why we're all still working on this, is to improve prognosis and improve the ability to tailor therapy. That's the ultimate goal. If we can understand who, at a level of the brain and a level of behavior, would best respond to a certain type of behavioral therapy, or best respond to a certain type of drug, or adjuvant therapy like transcranial direct current stimulation, if we can figure that out by studying the neuroscience of recovery, we would be able to hopefully tailor therapy for that person and improve prognosis, meaning we could improve the extent to which someone may ultimately be able to recover. And right now, the prognosis for aphasia just does not exist. Broken bones, you go in, you get a cast, they say 3 to 4 months, you should be able to get out of this cast, start physical therapy. You should have some weakness, but mostly improved by 1 year, just as an example. When we have brain damage and resultant behavior issues like aphasia, that type of conclusive prognosis just does not exist. So we're all working toward being able to give patients and their families more information and to help them make more informed decisions about what therapies to choose, for example. Something else that I want to bring up here is that we've been looking really heavily at what does the stroke do to the brain? A lot, right? Changes the brain's organization pretty substantially. But we also need to remember that a lot of individuals who are experiencing stroke are older. And with being older comes other health concerns generally. So overall brain health is something that we've been trying to measure and get a feel for how it impacts the brain's ability to change, to be neuroplastic, and then what happens when you couple it with a stroke. So one way that my colleagues and I have looked at this is to look at how the overall brain health by measuring white matter degeneration may actually add what we can understand as being an impairment on recovery. So what we found was that the more white matter degeneration you saw, over and above how big the stroke was, the worse the overall aphasia outcome was. And so this really brought to the forefront the fact that the overall brain health matters perhaps just as much as the stroke damage that's there. So white matter degeneration can happen from uncontrolled hypertension, high blood pressure, uncontrolled diabetes, for example, because it reduces blood flow to the brain. There's a variety of reasons why white matter degeneration occurs, and it just, we think, occurs because of age. So we see a lot more white matter degeneration in those who are much older, usually in their 80s, just because the brain, like the body, has a life cycle, and white matter is one of the first parts of the brain to degenerate. Another way that we've tried to look at overall brain health is by looking at how small vessel brain disease, which also affects white matter, seems to affect chronic aphasia. And we identified that small vessel disease, which again can be caused by things like hypertension, amongst other reasons, does impair the white matter, meaning that it impairs the transmission of information, and that can reduce the amount that someone with aphasia can recover. So for example, if they have a stroke and they have small vessel disease, their chances of recovering are even smaller, let's say, than someone without small vessel disease. So we're taking into account all these variables that we think might better help us to understand what's happening in the brain with recovery and how we might be able to improve prognosis, the ability to tell people, here's what we think might happen, here's a general time course that can just give more information to individuals who currently have very little. I always end it with a conclusions ... for now, because this is a constant changing atmosphere. I've linked a great new paper that literally just came out. I'm recording this in April 2023. This issue just came out last month, and it's a fascinating look at recovery in the first year after stroke. And there's no big overarching pattern. The pattern is that it matters where you have brain damage, but it's super individual even then. So I highly encourage finding this paper. It's got some great analyses related to biographical variables like age, for example. It's got different analyses related to lesion size and location. We're really trying to understand for each person if there is a way to understand recovery and prognosis. And I think we're getting closer with great studies like this that follow people over time. And I hope that we can keep pursuing this because it'll make a positive change on our ability to give more information and better information to individuals who are living with stroke and aphasia. As usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I am available there at that link. And the Neural Research Lab is my lab here at Indiana University Bloomington. Please feel free to check us out, see our papers. Everything that we publish is open source and listed on there. So you can find preprints and data sets if we have them. Everything should be available there. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to contact me. And I hope you enjoyed this series.